Judge Raymond Carter stared down at the trembling officers from his bench, his calm demeanor masking the rage beneath. 24 hours earlier, these same men had him face down on asphalt, calling him boy. Now their careers, freedom, and futures rested entirely in his hands. Before I continue this shocking story of justice turned upside down, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button if you believe in karma, and subscribe to never miss another incredible true story of justice served. Now let's rewind to see how a respected federal judge ended up handcuffed at a rural rest stop, and how those same officers found themselves standing before him the very next day. Judge Raymond Carter, 52. An esteemed federal judge with over 20 years on the bench was driving home from his mother's funeral in Mississippi to Atlanta. The day had been emotionally draining. Eulogizing Eleanor Carter, a pioneering civil rights activist who had marched with Dr. King, had left Raymond physically and mentally exhausted. As darkness fell and the interstate stretched endlessly before him, Raymond recognized the signs of fatigue. Responsible as always, he pulled into a rural Alabama rest area around 11 at night, deciding a short break would help him safely complete the final 3 hours of his journey. The rest stop was nearly deserted at this hour, with just 2 other vehicles in the spacious parking lot. Raymond parked his black Mercedes sedan under a flickering light and stepped out, stretching his cramped muscles. He was still wearing his expensive charcoal suit from the funeral, though it was now rumpled from the long drive. His red tie had been loosened, and his normally immaculate appearance showed signs of the emotional day. Finding a bench away from the vending machines, Raymond sat alone, sipping a bottle of water and looking up at the stars. His mother had always told him to look at the stars when feeling lost, saying their ancestors were watching over them. Lost in these memories, he didn't immediately notice the police cruiser that pulled into the rest area, circling slowly before parking nearby. Sergeant Brett Holloway, 44, and Officer Jason Keller, 29, had been patrolling this stretch of highway for years. The older Holloway had 17 years on the force and a reputation for keeping order in Wilcox County. His personnel file contained 6 complaints of excessive force, all dismissed. Keller, his junior partner for the past 3 years, was still impressionable and eager to please his mentor. When they spotted a black man in a suit sitting alone at the rest area, Holloway immediately changed their course. "Let's check this out," he muttered to Keller. "Doesn't look right." The officers approached Raymond deliberately, flashlights aimed directly at his face, temporarily blinding him. "Evening," Sergeant Holloway said, his tone already suspicious. "What brings you out here so late?" Raymond shielded his eyes from the harsh light, responding politely. "Just taking a break from driving, officer. Been on the road since this afternoon." Holloway didn't lower his flashlight. "Where you coming from? Where you headed?" His questions came rapid fire, the tone implying Raymond was already guilty of something. "I'm driving back to Atlanta from Greenwood, Mississippi. I was there for my mother's funeral," Raymond explained calmly, maintaining his composure despite the officer's confrontational approach. "Atlanta, huh?" Officer Keller interjected, his tone skeptical. "That's a nice suit for a long drive. What exactly do you do in Atlanta?" Raymond could sense the situation escalating, but maintained his dignified demeanor. "I'm a federal judge with the Northern District Court. I can show you my identification if you'd like." This statement, rather than diffusing the situation, seemed to trigger something in Holloway. His posture stiffened and his voice took on an edge. "Oh, a federal judge out here alone at 11 at night?" "Sure you are. Let's see that ID then." As Raymond reached slowly toward his inner jacket pocket, Officer Keller's hand immediately moved to his weapon. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he shouted, drawing his gun halfway. Raymond froze, heart pounding, hands raised slightly. "I was just reaching for my wallet as requested," he explained, his voice still measured despite the gun now pointed in his direction. "Sure you were," Holloway sneered. "Turn around and put your hands against the wall. We'll get your ID for you." Raymond knew enough about law enforcement encounters to understand that compliance was his safest option regardless of the injustice unfolding. He turned slowly, placing his palms against the concrete wall of the rest area building. Holloway roughly patted him down deliberately, excessive in his movements. Finding Raymond's wallet, he pulled it out and flipped it open, examining the judicial ID and credentials within. "This looks fake," he declared, despite the official federal seals and holograms. "You expect us to believe you're some hotshot judge?" Before Raymond could respond, Holloway grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. "We got a smartass here, Keller. Probably stolen identity. Let's take him in." Within seconds, Raymond found himself slammed face first onto the asphalt, his cheeks scraping against the rough surface as Holloway forced him down with a knee in his back. "Please," Raymond managed to say, "this is a mistake. Call the federal courthouse in Atlanta. They can verify who I am." "Shut up, boy." Holloway hissed the racial slur, deliberate and venomous, as he roughly handcuffed Raymond's wrists. "You don't tell us what to do." Keller, following his partner's lead, helped haul Raymond to his feet. They confiscated his phone keys and judicial ID, ignoring his continued calm insistence that a simple verification call would clear everything up. "Disorderly conduct and resisting arrest," Holloway announced, pushing Raymond toward their patrol car. "Maybe identity theft too, we'll see." As they forced him into the back seat, Raymond maintained his dignity, knowing that resistance would only give them an excuse for further violence. He remained silent, carefully memorizing their names, badge numbers, and every word spoken. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "When they show their true colors, watch carefully and remember everything. Your testimony will be your weapon." The patrol car ride to Wilcox County Sheriff's Station lasted 20 minutes, during which Sergeant Holloway and Officer Keller continued making disparaging remarks about Raymond's claims of being a federal judge. "Bet he's got a warrant somewhere," Holloway said loudly, intentionally within Raymond's hearing. "These types always do." Raymond remained silent, mentally recording every comment while discreetly testing his handcuffs, which were tight enough to cut into his wrists. The station was a small one-story brick building that had seen better days, with a reputation in civil rights circles for its disproportionate targeting of minorities passing through the county. As they pulled into the rear entrance, Raymond noted the time on the dashboard clock, 11:47 p.m. The officers roughly escorted him inside, where booking officer Mike Daniels, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a permanently scowling face, looked up with immediate disdain. "Got another troublemaker, Mike," Holloway announced, shoving Raymond forward. "Claims he's some big-shot federal judge." Daniels snorted derisively. "Sure he is, and I'm the Attorney General." The booking process was deliberately slow and humiliating. Raymond's requests to make his phone call were repeatedly ignored. "You'll get your call when we're good and ready," Daniels told him, taking his time with fingerprinting and photography. Raymond remained outwardly calm but internally cataloged every procedural violation occurring. His judicial credentials were tossed into a property bag with dismissive comments about nice fakes. When Raymond again politely insisted he was a federal judge with the Northern District Court, Daniels mockingly bowed. "Your Honor, would you prefer the presidential suite in our 5-star accommodations?" The officers around him laughed. After booking was finally completed, Raymond was led to a holding cell already occupied by a young black man in his early 20s. The cell was small, with a single bench, a stainless steel toilet without privacy, and walls covered in graffiti. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, never to be turned off through the night. As the cell door clanged shut, Raymond finally sat down, wincing slightly from the rough treatment during his arrest. The young man eyed him cautiously. "What they bring you in for, old man?" he asked after the officers were out of earshot. "Officially disorderly conduct and resisting arrest," Raymond replied quietly. "Though I did neither. I'm a federal judge who stopped to rest while driving home from my mother's funeral." The young man laughed without humor. "Right. And I'm Denzel Washington." He shook his head. "But seriously, what happened?" "I'm telling you the truth," Raymond said calmly. "My name is Raymond Carter. I'm a federal judge with the Northern District Court in Atlanta. I was simply sitting at the rest stop taking a break from driving when those officers decided I didn't belong there." The young man studied Raymond more carefully, noting his composed demeanor and articulate speech. "For real, man, they really messed up then." He extended his hand. "I'm Darnell Washington, engineering student at Georgia Tech. They got me for suspicious behavior, which means being black while putting gas in my car." Over the next hour, Raymond and Darnell shared their stories in hushed tones. Darnell had been driving back to school from visiting family when he was pulled over, searched without consent, and arrested when he questioned the legality of the search. His court date was scheduled for the following month. "You know what's crazy?" Darnell said. "I always told myself I'd know my rights and stand up for myself if this happened. But when those guns are pointing at you—" He trailed off. Raymond nodded. "The law looks very different from the wrong end of a weapon." Meanwhile, in another part of the station, Sergeant Holloway and Officer Keller were completing their arrest reports, fabricating details to justify their actions. Holloway described Raymond as belligerent and uncooperative, claiming he had made threatening movements when asked for identification. Keller, following his senior partner's lead, corroborated the false narrative, adding that the suspect had claimed to be a federal judge in an obvious attempt to intimidate officers. Neither report mentioned the racial slurs or excessive force used during the arrest. Sheriff Bill Watkins, a politically connected law enforcement veteran nearing retirement, reviewed the paperwork around midnight. Something about the name Raymond Carter tickled his memory. On a hunch, he typed the name into his computer along with "federal judge," and his face paled at the results. Judge Raymond Carter was indeed a highly respected federal judge appointed 15 years ago with a sterling reputation for fairness and constitutional expertise. More troublingly, he had jurisdiction over civil rights cases in 3 states, including Alabama. Watkins closed the browser quickly, deciding this was a problem better addressed in the morning. Perhaps things would somehow resolve themselves overnight. "Process everything normally," he instructed Daniels. "We'll sort it out tomorrow." Throughout the night, Raymond dozed intermittently on the hard bench, mind racing with thoughts of his mother. Eleanor Carter had been arrested during civil rights protests in the 1960s and had told him stories of her nights in jail cells not so different from this one. "The law is only as just as those who enforce it," she had told him when he became a judge. "Never forget there are 2 justice systems in America." The irony of experiencing this lesson so viscerally on the very day of her funeral wasn't lost on him. By dawn, word had begun spreading among the station staff that they might have a genuine federal judge in their holding cell. The overnight shift changed to morning staff with nervous glances directed toward Raymond's cell. Deputy Linda Morris, the morning booking officer, checked the arrest record and immediately called Sheriff Watkins at home. "Sir, I think we have a serious situation here," she said urgently. "The man brought in last night really appears to be Judge Carter from the federal court." Watkins, who had slept poorly worrying about exactly this confirmation, ordered her to take no action until he arrived. "Don't process any paperwork. Don't talk to him. Don't do anything," he instructed. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." Raymond, aware of the changing atmosphere, knew the reckoning would soon begin. He straightened his wrinkled suit as best he could and waited, his mother's strength flowing through him. Sheriff Bill Watkins arrived at the station precisely 18 minutes after receiving Deputy Morris's call, his usual swagger replaced by tense urgency. His first stop was his office computer, where he conducted a more thorough search on Judge Raymond Carter. The results confirmed his worst fears. Judge Carter wasn't just any federal judge. He was one of the most respected jurists in the Southeast, with a reputation for upholding civil rights and holding law enforcement accountable. His rulings on police misconduct cases were frequently cited in legal textbooks. Worse still, Judge Carter had recently been appointed to lead a federal task force examining racial bias in rural policing, exactly the kind of scrutiny Watkins had fought to avoid for his department. "Damn it all to hell," Watkins muttered, slamming his desk drawer. As Watkins was discovering the magnitude of his department's mistake, activity was already underway in Atlanta. Aisha Johnson, Judge Carter's dedicated judicial clerk for the past 8 years, had grown concerned when her boss failed to check in upon reaching Atlanta as planned. Their protocol for travel was clear, especially when driving alone at night. After leaving several unanswered messages, Aisha activated the emergency tracking feature on the judge's phone, a security measure implemented for federal judges following recent threats. The GPS pinpointed his location at the Wilcox County Sheriff's Station. Alarmed, Aisha immediately contacted both the State Attorney General's office and the U.S. Marshals Service, which was responsible for federal judicial protection. Judge Carter appears to be detained at a sheriff's station in rural Alabama, she reported. He was returning from his mother's funeral and should have been home hours ago. U.S. Marshal Director James Wilson took the report with grave concern. "We'll have a team there within the hour," he assured her, "and I'm personally notifying the FBI Civil Rights Division." Back at the sheriff's station, Watkins straightened his uniform and prepared to face Judge Carter. He instructed Deputy Morris to bring the judge to his office rather than meeting him in the cell, a small attempt to restore dignity to a situation spiraling beyond his control. When Raymond was escorted in, the physical evidence of his mistreatment was clear. A scraped cheek from being forced to the ground, bruised wrists from overly tight handcuffs, and a suit wrinkled and stained from the dirty cell floor. Despite this, Raymond's bearing remained regal, his gaze steady and evaluating. "Judge Carter," Watkins began, forcing a conciliatory smile. "There appears to have been an unfortunate misunderstanding last night." Raymond didn't return the smile. "Is that what you call racial profiling, excessive force, and deliberate violations of due process? Sheriff A. misunderstanding." His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of his judicial authority. Watkins swallowed uncomfortably. "I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience. We'll be dropping all charges immediately, of course, and you're free to go. Your personal effects will be returned right away." "And the young man in the cell with me, Darnell Washington?" Raymond asked. "His situation appears remarkably similar to mine." Watkins hesitated. "We'll review his case, certainly." "You'll release him now," Raymond stated rather than asked, "and return his belongings as well." Something in the judge's tone made Watkins nod quickly. "Of course, right away." "I'll need my phone," Raymond said next, "and privacy to make several calls." When Watkins returned with the phone, Raymond noted the battery had been deliberately drained overnight, another small indignity meant to exert control. He connected it to Watkins' office charger, and when it powered up, saw dozens of missed calls and messages. He dialed Chief Justice Williams of the Federal District Court, a colleague of 20 years. "Harold," he said when the Chief Justice answered, "I've had a rather educational night." He briefly explained the situation, aware that Sheriff Watkins was straining to eavesdrop from the hallway. "The officers involved are Sergeant Brett Holloway and Officer Jason Keller of the Wilcox County Sheriff's Department. Yes, I'm physically unharmed. No, they had no legitimate cause for detention. Yes, I'll await the marshals." He ended the call and made 2 more, one to Aisha confirming his status and another to his son David, letting him know he was safe. Within the hour, the small station was transformed by the arrival of federal agents. U.S. Marshals secured the building perimeter, while FBI agents from the Civil Rights Division began collecting evidence, surveillance footage, arrest reports, booking photos. An agent named Rodriguez specifically requested all departmental communications from the previous night, sensing the sheriff's attempt to cover tracks. Sergeant Holloway and Officer Keller, who had been off duty and asleep, were summoned back to the station. They arrived separately, both confused by the urgent recall, until they walked inside to find federal agents everywhere. The moment Holloway spotted Raymond sitting calmly in the conference room, now flanked by U.S. Marshals, the color drained from his face. "What's happening?" he demanded of Sheriff Watkins, who simply shook his head in warning. Agent Rodriguez approached the officers. "Gentlemen, we're investigating civil rights violations stemming from last night's unlawful detention of Federal Judge Raymond Carter. We'll need your firearms and badges while this investigation proceeds." As the officers surrendered their equipment, Raymond observed them without expression. The power dynamic had completely reversed in less than 12 hours. Darnell Washington, now released and having his property returned, stopped by the conference room door. "Judge Carter," he said with newfound respect. "Thank you." Raymond nodded. "We'll talk soon, Mr. Washington. I'll need your contact information." As federal agents took preliminary statements and secured evidence, Raymond knew this was just the beginning. The system that had so quickly presumed his criminality based solely on his race would now face the scrutiny of his office not for vengeance, but for the fundamental principle his mother had fought for: equal justice under law. Would you agree that what happened to Judge Carter demonstrates how racial profiling can affect anyone regardless of their status or position? Comment number 1. If you believe no one should be above the law, including police officers who abuse their power. Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed or experienced discrimination and want to see real change in our justice system. Subscribe now to follow this incredible story as it unfolds. How do you think those officers felt when they realized the man they'd abused was actually a federal judge with power over their futures? Let's continue to find out what happened in the immediate aftermath of this shocking reversal of fortune. By mid-afternoon, Judge Raymond Carter was finally on his way home to Atlanta, though not behind the wheel of his own vehicle. The U.S. Marshals had insisted on providing transportation with his Mercedes to be delivered later after being thoroughly examined for any tampering. Sitting in the back of the government SUV, Raymond watched the Alabama countryside roll past the same views he'd seen the previous day while driving to his mother's funeral. Everything looked different now, filtered through his experience of the past 15 hours. His body ached from the rough arrest and uncomfortable night, but his mind remained razor-sharp, processing the events and their implications with judicial precision. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications. Colleagues from across the federal judiciary had heard about the incident through internal channels offering support and outrage. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court had personally called expressing concern about the attack on judicial independence that Raymond's detention represented. Media inquiries were already flooding his office, though Aisha was deflecting them masterfully. As they crossed the Georgia state line, Raymond felt a weight lift slightly. 2 hours later, the SUV pulled into the driveway of his elegant Buckhead home, where his children were waiting. Maya Carter, 30, had followed her father into law, working as a civil rights attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. David Carter, 26, was in his final year of medical school at Emory University. Both rushed to embrace their father as he emerged from the vehicle. "Dad," Maya's voice cracked with emotion. "When Aisha called us, I was so scared." Raymond held his children close, allowing himself a moment of vulnerability he'd denied throughout the ordeal. "I'm all right," he assured them, though the scrape on his cheek and the careful way he moved told a different story. Inside the house, David immediately shifted into doctor mode, examining his father's injuries. "These wrist abrasions need treatment," he said gently, turning his father's hands to reveal the raw marks left by the handcuffs. "And I'm worried about your shoulder. The way you're favoring it suggests soft tissue damage." "Just some bruising?" Raymond dismissed, though he allowed his son to document the injuries with photographs and notes. "They weren't gentle when they took me down." Maya paced the living room, her legal mind already building a case. "This is textbook excessive force racial profiling, false arrest, multiple constitutional violations. They need to be held accountable, Dad. All of them." Raymond sank into his favorite leather chair, exhaustion finally catching up with him. "They will be, Maya, but carefully, methodically, and within the system." The afternoon brought a stream of visitors and calls. Judge Michael Richardson, Raymond's closest friend on the bench, arrived with food and moral support. "The entire 11th Circuit is in an uproar," he reported. "Judge Harmon is demanding a full investigation of every law enforcement agency in that county." Raymond shook his head. "This isn't just about me, Michael. If they treated a federal judge this way, a professional man in a suit driving a luxury car, imagine how they treat ordinary citizens without my resources and connections." Even as they spoke, Raymond's case was sending shockwaves through legal and political circles. The governor of Alabama issued a statement calling the incident deeply troubling and promising a state-level investigation. The U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama announced that her office would be reviewing the case for potential federal charges against the officers involved. By evening, Raymond had conferred with several colleagues about the ethical dimensions of his situation. As the victim, he couldn't preside over any case involving the officers or department, but he could ensure the matter was handled properly through appropriate channels. "I'll need to recuse myself from direct involvement," he told Maya. But there are other ways to address the systemic issues this reveals. While Raymond worked through the legal implications, developments continued in Wilcox County. Sheriff Watkins had called an emergency meeting with county attorneys, desperately seeking damage control strategies. The county commissioner, fearing enormous liability, was already reaching out through political connections to try to contain the situation. The police union issued a statement supporting Officers Holloway and Keller, claiming they had followed protocol for suspicious activity, and suggesting Judge Carter had escalated the situation, a narrative immediately contradicted by witness statements and partial footage from the rest stop security cameras. Both officers had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, though with pay a detail that infuriated many community members. Officer Keller, the younger and less experienced of the two, sat alone in his apartment watching news coverage with growing dread. His girlfriend, a nurse named Sarah, tried to reassure him. "You were just following Holloway's lead, Jason. They'll understand that." Keller shook his head. "You didn't see how we treated him, Sarah. And he was so calm, so dignified through all of it, like he knew something we didn't." He couldn't shake the image of the judge's eyes observing and remembering every detail of his mistreatment. Sergeant Holloway, meanwhile, projected defiance, telling fellow officers over drinks that he'd do the same thing again, given the circumstances. How were we supposed to know he was really a judge black guy in a suit claiming to be important? We hear that kind of thing all the time. What Holloway didn't share was his growing fear as he researched Judge Carter's reputation for handling police misconduct cases. Back in Atlanta, Raymond reconnected with Darnell Washington by phone, the young engineering student having returned to his campus apartment. "Mr. Washington, I want you to know I'll be monitoring your case personally," Raymond assured him. "What happened to you matters just as much as what happened to me." Darnell's voice was emotional. "I always wanted to believe in the system, sir. That's why I was considering law school after engineering. But after last night, the system is imperfect," Raymond acknowledged, "built and maintained by imperfect people. That's precisely why it needs good people willing to improve it from within." He paused. "Would you be willing to meet with some colleagues of mine? Your experience could be valuable in addressing the broader pattern." Darnell agreed, and Raymond made arrangements for him to speak with federal investigators later that week. As night fell, Raymond finally allowed himself some rest, though sleep came fitfully. In his dreams, he saw his mother's face, her expression both sad and knowing. "The struggle continues." She seemed to say the phrase she had often repeated during her lifetime of activism. Raymond knew the next days and weeks would test not only the justice system he had served for decades, but also his own commitment to its highest principles. The very courthouse where he normally presided with unquestioned authority had for one night been utterly irrelevant to those who saw only his skin color. The question now was how to translate this personal injustice into meaningful change, not just punishment for individual officers, but reform of the systems that empowered and protected them. 1 week after the incident, the federal investigation into the Wilcox County Sheriff's Department had expanded far beyond Judge Carter's unlawful detention. FBI agents had taken over a local motel, converting it into a temporary field office as they collected evidence and conducted interviews. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture of departmental culture and practices. Text messages retrieved from department phones revealed officers routinely using racial slurs and derogatory language when discussing black motorists or detainees. More troublingly, investigators uncovered what appeared to be an unofficial competition among certain officers for arrests of minorities passing through the county, with Sergeant Holloway frequently leading these statistics. "Check this out," Agent Sophia Martinez said to her colleague, pointing to a text exchange between Holloway and another officer. "Got another one at the rest stop. That's 3 this week. You owe me lunch." The timestamp matched the night of Judge Carter's arrest. "They were treating it like a game," her colleague replied disgustedly. Body camera footage from previous incidents showed a pattern similar to Judge Carter's experience: respectful black motorists suddenly facing escalating aggression, often with cameras malfunctioning during key moments of encounters. Most disturbing was how many of these cases had been resolved, charges dropped after detention, suggesting the arrests themselves, not convictions, were the primary goal. FBI Director Jackson had assigned Agent Martinez specifically because of her background in internal affairs investigations. As she interviewed department staff, a picture emerged of a toxic culture sanctioned and encouraged by leadership. Junior officers described an unofficial training period where they were taught which cars to pull over, which people to question, and how to write reports that would justify these actions legally. "Holloway was like the department's field trainer for this stuff," a young deputy admitted nervously. "Sheriff Watkins would just say, 'Keep the county safe,' but everyone knew what that meant." While federal investigators built their case, Sheriff Watkins was actively working to undermine them. Security footage from the station mysteriously developed technical problems for the night of Judge Carter's detention. Department emails from the critical period were deleted, though FBI tech specialists were already working to recover them. Deputies were instructed to stay loyal, in a thinly veiled warning about cooperating with federal agents. This obstruction only intensified federal scrutiny. Agent Martinez obtained a warrant for Watkins's county and personal phones, finding messages to county commissioners discussing how to contain the situation and protect the department's approach to maintaining order. Meanwhile, Officer Jason Keller found himself increasingly isolated within the department. His initial statements to investigators had been cautious but more forthcoming than other officers, describing how he had followed Sergeant Holloway's lead during Judge Carter's arrest. This perceived lack of absolute loyalty made him a pariah among colleagues. In the department break room, conversations would stop when he entered. His locker was vandalized with the word "rat" scratched into the metal. Holloway, once his mentor, now refused to speak to him directly. This ostracism led Keller to question everything about his 3 years on the force. Had he become the very thing he'd sworn to stand against when he'd entered the police academy? The memory of Judge Carter's dignified silence in the face of their abuse haunted his nights. In Atlanta, Judge Carter was struggling with his own aftermath, while physically recovering. The psychological impact of his detention manifested in unexpected ways. Driving home from the courthouse one evening, a police car pulled up behind him at a traffic light. Though the officer was simply waiting for the light like any other driver, Raymond felt his heart rate spike, palms instantly sweating as his body reacted to the potential threat. The light changed and the police car turned right while Raymond continued straight, but the momentary panic lingered. This wasn't fear as he had known it before. This was something deeper, a visceral understanding of vulnerability that no amount of judicial authority could erase. He confided this experience to his friend Judge Michael Richardson during their weekly lunch. "I've sentenced murderers, Michael. I've faced death threats from cartel members, but I've never felt this kind of fundamental unsafety." Richardson nodded solemnly. "You've crossed a line, Raymond. You've experienced what so many people in our courtrooms have been trying to tell us for years. The question is, what I do with this experience," Raymond said. "Am I pursuing justice, or am I using my position for personal vengeance? The line feels blurrier than I'd like to admit." Richardson considered this carefully. "Perhaps the real question is whether your personal experience makes you less objective or more informed. The law doesn't exist in abstraction, it lives in human experience." The media coverage of the incident had intensified, dividing along predictable lines. Some outlets portrayed Judge Carter as an elite, using his position to punish officers who were just doing their job. Others highlighted the case as emblematic of systemic racism in policing. Conservative commentator William Burke claimed on his national show that Carter was overreacting to standard procedure, while progressive journalist Tanya Washington's in-depth article titled "When a Judge Becomes the Judged" went viral, examining how even the highest achievements and status couldn't protect Black Americans from racial profiling. In Wilcox County, tensions were escalating beyond the department. A rally organized in support of the officers drew approximately 200 people, many carrying signs with slogans like "Back the Blue" and "Protect Our Protectors." When a smaller group of counter-protesters arrived, verbal confrontations quickly escalated. Local Black residents spoke of their own experiences with the department only to be shouted down by officer supporters. The county had become a microcosm of the national debate about race and policing, with Judge Carter's case as its flashpoint. 3 weeks after the incident, Agent Martinez made a breakthrough. A night shift dispatcher named Rebecca Winters came forward with recordings she had secretly made over the past year, documenting what she called the department's targeting system. The recordings included Sheriff Watkins explicitly instructing officers to focus on out-of-state vehicles with certain drivers, and Sergeant Holloway training new officers on which profiles to watch for at the county's rest stops and gas stations. "I knew it was wrong," Winters told Martinez, "but I needed this job. When I heard what happened to that judge, though, I couldn't stay silent anymore." This evidence, combined with statistical analysis showing dramatically disproportionate stops and arrests of minority drivers, created a compelling case for systemic discrimination rather than isolated misconduct. The investigation was building toward something much larger than individual charges against 2 officers. It was revealing a county-wide system designed to harass and extract money from minority travelers, a modern version of the predatory practices that had once been common throughout the Jim Crow South. As federal pressure intensified, cracks in the department's unity widened. Deputies began looking out for themselves, quietly contacting attorneys and considering cooperation agreements. Sheriff Watkins, sensing his control slipping, became increasingly erratic, shredding documents late at night and installing new locks on his office door. The reckoning that Judge Carter had set in motion was gathering momentum, moving beyond his personal experience toward a confrontation with decades of entrenched practices and attitudes. In Atlanta, Raymond continued his judicial duties while monitoring the investigation's progress. Each night he spoke to his mother's photograph on his bedside table, updating her on developments as if she were still alive. "The system resists change, Mother, just as you always said, but perhaps sometimes it just needs the right pressure applied at the right point." The pressure was building, and something in Wilcox County was bound to break. 1 month after Judge Raymond Carter's unlawful detention, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama called a press conference. With federal agents flanking her at the podium, she announced formal charges against Sergeant Brett Holloway, Officer Jason Keller, and Sheriff Bill Watkins. "Following an extensive investigation," she stated, "we are filing federal charges for civil rights violations, falsification of official reports, and obstruction of justice. The evidence reveals not just misconduct in Judge Carter's case, but a pattern of discriminatory practices targeting minority citizens." The charges sent shockwaves through Wilcox County and the law enforcement community. A sitting sheriff being federally charged was rare enough. The additional allegations of systematic racial profiling made the case nationally significant. The defendants were not arrested but instructed to surrender for processing the following morning. Their arraignment was scheduled for the federal courthouse in Montgomery, with Judge Thomas Anderson assigned to preside. Judge Anderson, 64, was a Reagan appointee with a reputation for strict procedural fairness and a by-the-book approach to criminal cases. His assignment to the case was seen as significant, neither an obvious ally nor enemy to either side. Raymond watched the press conference from his chambers in Atlanta, his expression revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. His clerk, Aisha, stood nearby. "Are you going to attend?" she asked after the announcement concluded. Raymond nodded. I'll be there as a witness to the facts, nothing more." The next morning, as the defendants arrived at the federal courthouse, they were met by a divided crowd. Supporters had organized a demonstration with about 300 people chanting, "Stand with our officers," and "Blue Lives Matter." Across the plaza, an equal number of counter-protesters carried signs reading, "Justice for all means all," and "No one above the law." The atmosphere was tense, with federal officers maintaining separation between the groups. Raymond arrived through a secure judicial entrance, avoiding the media gauntlet at the main doors. Though he wouldn't be testifying at this preliminary hearing, his presence would be noted the first time he would face his arresters since that night at the sheriff's station. Inside the courtroom, Raymond sat in the witness section, his posture impeccable, his expression neutral. When the defendants entered, Officer Keller glanced at him briefly, quickly, looking away when their eyes met. Sergeant Holloway stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the judge's presence. Sheriff Watkins, attempting to project confidence, nodded toward Raymond with forced casualness, as if they were mere acquaintances passing in public. Judge Anderson called the court to order his tone, making it clear he would tolerate no disruptions. The charges were read, and all three defendants entered not guilty pleas through their attorneys. The prosecution outlined the basic facts of the case, including the unlawful detention of Judge Carter and the subsequent discovery of departmental patterns of discrimination. Defense attorneys argued for dismissal, claiming their clients had acted within proper procedure and that Judge Carter's detention had been a reasonable mistake rather than misconduct. Judge Anderson denied the dismissal motions, finding sufficient evidence to proceed. "This case will continue to a full trial," he announced. "Given the serious nature of the charges and the evidence presented, I find the government has met its burden for proceeding." As the hearing concluded, Raymond observed the defendants' reactions. Sheriff Watkins whispered urgently to his attorney. Sergeant Holloway maintained his stone-faced demeanor. But it was Officer Keller who caught Raymond's attention. The young officer seemed deflated, the reality of his situation visibly weighing on him. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. Public sentiment had divided sharply along racial and political lines. Raymond received messages of support from across the country, but also death threats serious enough to warrant increased security at his home and office. News vans parked outside his Atlanta residence, forcing him to enter and exit through a neighbor's property. His children worried constantly about his safety. Officer Keller, too, was feeling the pressure from multiple directions. The police union representatives had made it clear that absolute loyalty to his fellow officers was expected, but federal prosecutors had approached his attorney with discussions about a potential plea deal. As the junior officer who had followed Holloway's lead, Keller was in a unique position to provide testimony about departmental practices. At home, Keller's girlfriend urged him to cooperate. "This isn't going away, Jason," Sarah told him. "Those federal prosecutors have more evidence than they're showing. If you wait until everyone starts cutting deals, you'll have nothing to offer them." Keller paced their small apartment. "If I talk, I'm done in law enforcement. Forever. No department will ever hire me." "And if you don't talk," she countered, "you could go to prison, Jason. Is protecting Holloway and Watkins worth that?" The question haunted him through sleepless nights. Meanwhile, Sheriff Watkins was taking aggressive action to protect himself. He leaked Officer Keller's personnel file to friendly media outlets, revealing a previous citizen complaint that Watkins himself had buried to protect the department. The message was clear: if Keller cooperated with prosecutors, more damaging information would follow. This backfired dramatically when federal investigators discovered Watkins had concealed the complaint, adding evidence to the obstruction charges and demonstrating the sheriff's willingness to manipulate records. Sergeant Holloway maintained his innocence publicly, while privately approaching associates about character witnesses and creating alternative narratives about the night of Judge Carter's arrest. "It was dark, we couldn't see clearly, he moved suddenly." The evolving story aimed to transform a racially motivated detention into a reasonable mistake. In Atlanta, Maya Carter was channeling her anger into action. Working with civil rights organizations, she began identifying other victims of Wilcox County's discriminatory practices. "Dad, there are dozens of cases," she told Raymond over dinner. "Most people just paid their fines and tried to put it behind them. They didn't have the resources or platform to fight back." Raymond nodded thoughtfully. "Document everything. This isn't just about my case anymore." The FBI investigation had expanded to neighboring jurisdictions, finding similar patterns throughout the region. What had begun as a response to one judge's mistreatment was evolving into a comprehensive examination of rural policing practices across 3 states. 2 weeks later, Judge Anderson issued his ruling on pretrial motions denying defense attempts to exclude key evidence and witness testimony. The trial will proceed with the full range of evidence the prosecution has gathered. He declared a significant victory for the government's case. The trial date was set for 3 months later. During this period of legal maneuvering, Raymond made a pilgrimage to his mother's grave in Mississippi. Kneeling beside the fresh marble headstone, he placed a bouquet of her favorite yellow roses. "I understand more now, Mother," he said quietly. "All those stories you told me about your arrests in the 60s about the 2 different Americas. I thought I understood intellectually, but now I know in my bones." He traced her name engraved in the stone. "Your work continues through me, though not in the way either of us would have chosen." The quiet cemetery moment centered him, connecting his personal experience to the larger historical struggle his mother had been part of. This wasn't just about his dignity or justice for one night of mistreatment, it was about continuing a generational fight for the fundamental promise of equal protection under the law. Do you believe our justice system treats everyone equally, regardless of race, wealth, or status? Comment number 1. If you think we need more accountability for those who abuse their power, and hit that like button if you've ever witnessed the double standards in our society. Subscribe to follow this powerful story to its conclusion. What would you do if you were Officer Keller, cooperate with investigators, or maintain the blue wall of silence? As we'll see next, someone is about to make a decision that will change everything. In this case, pushing one person to a breaking point from which there's no return. Can a system protect those who enforce the law while still holding them accountable when they break it? Let's find out as our story continues. As the trial date approached, pressure mounted on all parties involved. Federal prosecutors, confident in their evidence, but aware of the case's national implications, intensified their efforts to secure insider testimony. Their primary target was Officer Jason Keller, the youngest and seemingly most conflicted of the defendants. Through his attorney, they offered a deal: full cooperation against Sheriff Watkins and Sergeant Holloway in exchange for reduced charges and a recommendation for probation rather than prison time. After weeks of agonizing deliberation and multiple tense negotiations, Keller finally agreed to the terms. On a rainy Tuesday morning, he arrived at the federal building in Birmingham with his attorney to formally sign the agreement and provide his initial sworn statement. For 6 hours, he detailed the department's discriminatory practices, the specific events of Judge Carter's arrest, and the subsequent cover-up attempts. He described how new officers were taught which vehicles to target, how reports were written to justify racially motivated stops, and how Sheriff Watkins personally reviewed arrests of certain types of individuals. Most damning was his account of Sergeant Holloway's behavior during Judge Carter's detention, the racial slurs, the deliberate humiliation, and the fabrication of evidence afterward. "Holloway said we hit the jackpot when we saw him," Keller testified. "A black man in a nice car at our rest stop after dark. He said these were the easy ones." The prosecutors recorded everything, knowing this testimony would be central to their case. What they couldn't know was the psychological toll the decision had taken on Keller. He had received dozens of threatening messages from fellow officers after rumors of his cooperation spread. Longtime friends had cut contact. His girlfriend Sarah had moved out temporarily after someone shot through their apartment window. As he left the federal building that evening, Keller felt neither relief nor virtue, only a crushing isolation. He checked into a motel under an assumed name following his attorney's advice to avoid his apartment until security arrangements could be made. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he stared at his phone, scrolling through old photos of his police academy graduation, of departmental picnics, of the life and brotherhood he had just abandoned. Around midnight, he began writing on the motel stationery a lengthy letter explaining his actions, his regrets, and his hopes that something positive might emerge from the department's reckoning. At 2:17 a.m., Jason Keller placed his badge and the completed letter on the motel desk, walked to his car in the deserted parking lot, and used his service weapon to shoot himself in the chest. A passing delivery driver heard the shot and called 911, but by the time paramedics arrived, Keller had lost consciousness from blood loss. They rushed him to Birmingham General Hospital, where emergency surgeons worked frantically to repair the damage. Word of Keller's suicide attempt spread rapidly through law enforcement and legal circles. By morning, both the hospital's entrance and Keller's room were secured by federal agents protecting him from potential threats and managing the media frenzy that erupted once the story broke. His condition was listed as critical but stable after surgery. Judge Raymond Carter learned about Keller's suicide attempt while preparing for court. The news hit him with unexpected force. This young officer, who had participated in his humiliation but then chosen truth over loyalty, had been driven to this desperate act. Though he had never spoken directly with Keller, Raymond felt a complex connection to him now. They were both casualties of the same broken system, though in vastly different ways. "I'd like to visit him," Raymond told Aisha, surprising his clerk. "Is that appropriate?" she asked cautiously. "The case is still pending, and he's a defendant." "Not as a judge," Raymond clarified, "as a human being who understands something about being trapped in an impossible situation." After consulting with ethics counsel and prosecutors, arrangements were made for a brief supervised visit. Raymond entered Keller's hospital room that evening to find the young officer pale in sedated tubes and monitors surrounding his bed. Though conscious, Keller seemed only vaguely aware of his visitor. "Officer Keller," Raymond said quietly, standing at the bedside, "I don't know if you can hear me, but I wanted you to know that your choice to tell the truth matters. Whatever led you to this moment, please know that your life has value and purpose." Keller's eyes focused briefly on Raymond's face, a flicker of recognition crossing his features before he drifted back into medicated sleep. Raymond left shortly after, profoundly troubled by the human cost of this pursuit of justice. Keller's suicide note, now in federal evidence, had expanded the investigation's scope. In it, he had named officers from neighboring counties who participated in the same discriminatory practices and identified local judges who routinely approved questionable warrants and charges against minority defendants. What had begun as an isolated incident was revealing an entrenched regional network of systemic discrimination. Sheriff Watkins now faced additional charges for witness tampering, as Keller's note detailed threats made against him and other officers who might cooperate. The sheriff's political protection was crumbling. County commissioners who had initially supported him were distancing themselves as the full extent of the department's practices became public. Meanwhile, the case was having ripple effects throughout Wilcox County. Local residents who had suffered similar mistreatment began coming forward, encouraged by Judge Carter's example and the serious federal response. Community meetings in church basements and school gymnasiums became impromptu forums for sharing long-suppressed stories of abuse and discrimination. A retired teacher described being handcuffed in front of her students during a traffic stop. A local doctor recounted how his teenage son was held at gunpoint for matching a description. A business owner detailed how his store was repeatedly searched without warrants. Each story contributed to a devastating portrait of systemic harassment. Sergeant Holloway, watching his department and defense strategy unravel, made an unexpected move. Through intermediaries, he requested a private meeting with Judge Carter. Against the strong advice of prosecutors and his own family, Raymond agreed, stipulating that the meeting take place at the federal courthouse under marshal supervision. 2 days later, they sat across from each other in a conference room, the first direct conversation since the night of Raymond's arrest. "Why did you want this meeting, Sergeant?" Raymond asked, his tone neutral. Holloway seemed smaller somehow, his uniform replaced by civilian clothes, his usual confidence diminished but not extinguished. "I wanted to see if we could work something out," he said, avoiding direct eye contact. "This situation has gotten out of hand. Keller shooting himself, the department under federal control, all these investigations." "And you think I can stop it?" Raymond asked. "I'm a witness in this case, not the prosecutor." "But they'd listen to you," Holloway insisted. "If you said you were satisfied with administrative punishment, internal discipline, maybe they'd back off the federal charges." Raymond studied the man who had called him boy while forcing him face down onto asphalt. "Tell me, Sergeant Holloway, in all your years of service, how many other Raymond Carters have there been? People who didn't have a federal judgeship to protect them afterward." Holloway's expression hardened. "We maintain order in our jurisdiction. That's our job. By targeting black drivers, by competing for arrests of minorities, by falsifying reports." Holloway leaned forward. "You don't understand what it's like in these rural areas. We do what we need to do." "I understand perfectly," Raymond replied. "My mother grew up under Jim Crow in Mississippi." The officers then believed they were maintaining order, too. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, revealing Holloway's unchanged attitudes despite the department's unraveling. He expressed concern for his pension, his reputation, his future, but no real remorse for the discriminatory system he had enforced. Raymond left the meeting with a clearer understanding. True justice would require more than individual punishment. It demanded fundamental systemic change. That night, drawing on his judicial experience and personal ordeal, Raymond drafted a comprehensive proposal for police reform. It included independent oversight boards with community representation, mandatory body camera protocols with penalties for non-compliance, revised training procedures focused on de-escalation and cultural awareness, and an anonymous reporting system for officers to flag misconduct without fear of retaliation. This wasn't just about punishing Holloway Watkins and their department, it was about preventing future abuses across the system. The next morning brought another seismic development. Someone within the sheriff's department had leaked the complete body camera footage of Judge Carter's arrest to the media. For the first time, the public could witness the full interaction: Raymond's calm compliance, Holloway's escalating aggression, the racial slurs, the excessive force. The footage contradicted every claim made by the officers about that night, vindicating Raymond's account entirely. Public opinion, already shifting, crystallized further around the reality of what had occurred. The stage was set for the trial that would not only determine the fate of the remaining defendants, but potentially reshape policing practices throughout the region. Raymond watched the footage once, then turned off his television. He didn't need to relive the experience. He carried it with him every day. What mattered now was transforming that painful night into meaningful change, fulfilling the promise he'd made at his mother's grave to continue her work for equal justice, though through means neither of them could have anticipated. The federal courthouse in Montgomery had seen many historic cases since its construction in the 1930s, from civil rights trials to political corruption prosecutions. On the morning the United States versus Holloway and Watkins trial began, the building was surrounded by media trucks, demonstrators, and heavy security. Inside courtroom 3, with its soaring ceilings and dark wood paneling, Judge Thomas Anderson called the proceedings to order precisely at 9 o'clock. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Vanessa Rodriguez, had constructed their case methodically over the preceding months. Their opening statement laid out a compelling narrative not just about one night's injustice against Judge Carter, but about a systematic pattern of constitutional violations spanning years. "This case will demonstrate that the defendants didn't merely make a mistake," Rodriguez told the jury. "They were operating within a culture of discrimination they themselves had created and maintained, a two-tiered system of justice based explicitly on race." Defense attorneys for Sheriff Watkins and Sergeant Holloway presented contrasting strategies. Watkins's lawyer portrayed him as an administrator removed from day-to-day operations, unaware of his officer's actions until after the fact. Holloway's defense painted him as a dedicated officer, making split-second decisions in potentially dangerous situations, suggesting Judge Carter's detention was an unfortunate but reasonable mistake rather than discrimination. The jury, 7 women and 5 men of diverse backgrounds, listened attentively as the first witnesses were called. Technical experts presented the body camera footage, enhanced to capture every word and action during Judge Carter's detention. FBI analysts detailed text messages showing the department's targeting patterns. Former dispatchers testified about coded language used to identify minority drivers. But the most anticipated testimony came on the third day, delivered via video link from Officer Jason Keller's hospital room. Still recovering from his suicide attempt, Keller appeared gaunt and subdued, his hospital gown visible above the frame. After establishing his background and role in the department, prosecutors guided him through the events of Judge Carter's arrest and the department's subsequent cover-up. Sergeant Holloway spotted Judge Carter sitting on the bench and immediately said we should check him out, Keller testified. When I asked why, he said black male after dark at our rest stop driving an expensive car, either drugs or stolen. Keller detailed how despite Judge Carter's calm cooperation and identification as a federal judge, Holloway had escalated the situation deliberately. He wanted to make an example of him, Keller explained. There was this attitude that certain people needed to be reminded of their place when passing through our county. Judge Carter was respectful the entire time, but that almost seemed to make Sergeant Holloway angrier. The most damning testimony concerned the department's broader practices. Keller described the unofficial competition for minority arrests, the tampering with evidence, the coaching on report writing to justify discriminatory stops. He identified Sheriff Watkins as not merely aware of these practices, but actively encouraging them through promotions assignments and direct instructions at staff meetings. During cross-examination, defense attorneys attempted to portray Keller as a desperate man seeking leniency by fabricating allegations against his former colleagues. They highlighted his suicide attempt as evidence of mental instability and questioned why he hadn't reported these practices earlier if he found them so objectionable. Keller's response was simple. I was wrong. I went along with it because that's what everyone did. It took something like this, seeing someone like Judge Carter treated this way, and then watching the department try to cover it up for me, to realize how far we'd gone from what we're supposed to stand for. The defense's aggressive questioning of a visibly unwell Keller backfired with the jury, several of whom appeared sympathetic to the young officer's evident remorse. On the 5th day of trial, Sheriff Watkins took the stand in his own defense. Projecting the confident authority that had maintained his position for 15 years, he denied direct knowledge of discriminatory practices, presenting himself as an administrator focused on policy rather than street-level enforcement. Our department enforces the law equally for all citizens, he insisted. If individual officers deviated from our standards, that would be addressed through proper channels. This testimony crumbled during cross-examination when prosecutors presented emails, meeting minutes, and performance reviews in which Watkins explicitly praised officers for increased arrest statistics in areas where minorities typically traveled. Most damaging was an audio recording from a department training session where Watkins instructed officers on maintaining the county's character by ensuring certain elements didn't get too comfortable passing through. Sergeant Holloway adopted a different approach, admitting to Judge Carter's detention, but insisting it was based on legitimate suspicion rather than racial bias. It was late at night, an isolated rest area known for drug activity and an individual who seemed out of place, he testified. Race had nothing to do with our decision to investigate. During cross-examination, Rodriguez methodically dismantled this narrative, using the department's own statistics to show that white travelers in identical circumstances were almost never approached or detained. She presented Holloway's text messages about getting another one the night of Judge Carter's arrest and his recorded comments about teaching him his place regardless of what fancy job he claims to have. By the trial's second week, the prosecution's case had grown increasingly compelling, but the courtroom fell completely silent when Judge Raymond Carter himself was called to testify. Impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, he walked to the witness stand with the measured dignity that defined his professional life. After being sworn in, he recounted the events of that night with judicial precision: his mother's funeral, the fatigue that led him to stop the officer's approach, and the escalating detention. "I identified myself as a federal judge and offered to show my credentials," he testified. Sergeant Holloway responded by saying, and I quote, "Sure you are," with obvious sarcasm. When I reached slowly for my identification as requested, Officer Keller drew his weapon. Raymond described the physical detention in clinical detail: the knee in his back, the excessively tight handcuffs, the racial slurs, the deliberate humiliation during transport and booking. Throughout his testimony, he maintained the same calm demeanor he had shown during his arrest, his words carrying extra weight precisely because of their measured delivery. During cross-examination, defense attorneys attempted to suggest that Raymond's status had made him unwilling to comply with ordinary police procedures, that he expected special treatment because of his position. "Your Honor." The attorney began using Raymond's judicial title despite him appearing as a witness. "Isn't it possible that your expectation of deference, due to your position, contributed to the misunderstanding that night?" Raymond's response was measured but direct. "Counselor, I did not expect deference. I expected the same constitutional protections as any other citizen. I identified myself truthfully and complied fully with all lawful orders. I was detained not because of any action on my part, but because officers saw a black man in a location they had decided black men should not be." The defense attorney tried another approach. "But surely you can understand how officers working at night might be suspicious of anyone at a rest stop at that hour." "I understand that officers have discretion in investigating suspicious activity," Raymond replied. "What I experienced wasn't investigation. It was predetermined targeting based on race. Officers Holloway and Keller decided I was suspicious before they spoke a single word to me, before they knew anything about me except the color of my skin." As Raymond stepped down from the witness stand, his eyes briefly met Holloway's. In that moment, both men seemed to recognize the full circle of their interaction, from the power imbalance of that night at the rest stop to the reverse dynamics of the federal courtroom. The most dramatic moment of the trial came unexpectedly during Sergeant Holloway's cross-examination on the final day of testimony. Confronted with overwhelming evidence contradicting his previous statements, including newly discovered dash cam footage showing him bragging about the arrest to another officer, Holloway's carefully constructed defense crumbled. In a stunning reversal, he changed his plea to guilty mid-testimony. "I can't continue this," he said, interrupting the prosecutor's question. "What we did to Judge Carter was wrong. What we've been doing in the department for years was wrong." The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Judge Anderson called for order. After a brief recess for Holloway to consult with his attorney, he formally changed his plea to guilty on all counts. Sheriff Watkins, now the sole remaining defendant, sat stone-faced as his former officer abandoned their united defense. In closing arguments, the prosecution emphasized the systemic nature of the discrimination, urging the jury to hold Watkins accountable not just for Judge Carter's case, but for fostering the culture that made such abuses routine. The defense made a final attempt to distance Watkins from direct involvement, portraying him as an administrator betrayed by rogue officers. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning with their verdict guilty on all counts for Sheriff Watkins. As the forewoman read the decision, Raymond sat perfectly still in the gallery, his expression unchanged. This wasn't about personal vindication, it was about affirming a principle his mother had fought for, that the law must protect everyone equally, regardless of race, status, or circumstance. Judge Anderson thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following morning, making the unusual request that Judge Carter be present as both victim and judicial colleague to offer perspective on appropriate punishment. The sentencing hearing opened to a packed courtroom. News of the guilty verdicts had dominated national headlines, transforming what began as one man's wrongful detention into a landmark case with implications for policing practices nationwide. Judge Thomas Anderson called the court to order, his expression grave, as he addressed the unusual nature of the proceedings. Before determining appropriate sentences, I wish to acknowledge the historic significance of this case, he began. When those entrusted to enforce the law instead violate the very rights they've sworn to protect, the damage extends beyond individual victims to the foundation of our justice system itself. Judge Anderson then did something unprecedented. He invited Judge Raymond Carter to address the court regarding sentencing considerations. While I maintain full authority over sentencing decisions, Anderson explained, Judge Carter's unique perspective as both victim and judicial colleague offers valuable insight into appropriate remedies. Raymond approached the podium with measured steps. He had prepared carefully for this moment, understanding its potential impact far beyond the individual defendants. Your Honor, he began, I come before you today not seeking vengeance, but justice, not just for myself, but for every citizen who has faced discrimination under color of law. For the next 30 minutes, Raymond articulated a vision of accountability balanced with opportunity for redemption. He recommended substantial but not maximum sentences for both defendants, coupled with mandatory participation in racial bias education and community service in predominantly black neighborhoods after release. Punishment alone cannot heal what has been broken, he stated. True justice requires both accountability for past actions and transformation to prevent future harm. He proposed that Sergeant Holloway, who had ultimately accepted responsibility through his guilty plea, receive 7 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release, including 2,000 hours of community service in minority communities. For Sheriff Watkins, whose greater authority carried greater responsibility, he suggested 10 years imprisonment with similar post-release requirements. Additionally, Raymond continued, I believe structural reforms are essential to address the systemic issues this case has revealed. He outlined his proposal for comprehensive departmental overhaul, including independent oversight, revised training, and community participation in policing standards. What happened to me was not an isolated incident, but the product of entrenched practices. Meaningful justice requires addressing both individual actions and the systems that enabled them. As Raymond concluded, the courtroom remained silent, absorbing the weight of his words. Even the defendants seemed moved by the absence of vindictiveness in his recommendations. Judge Anderson thanked Raymond and then delivered his sentencing decision, largely adopting the proposed terms while adding financial restitution to identified victims of the department's discriminatory practices. This court finds that the defendant's actions represent profound violations of the public trust, Anderson stated. However, I also recognize the potential for redemption expressed in Judge Carter's recommendations. Sergeant Holloway received 8 years in federal prison while Sheriff Watkins was sentenced to 12 years. Both would be required to complete extensive community service and racial justice education upon release. As officers led the defendants away, Holloway turned briefly toward Raymond, a complex look of regret passing across his features. Raymond acknowledged him with a slight nod, not forgiveness exactly, but recognition of the human complexity behind the uniform. In the weeks following the sentencing, Raymond channeled his experience into concrete action. He announced the establishment of a judicial initiative addressing racial bias in policing named the Eleanor Carter Justice Project in honor of his mother. My mother spent her life fighting for equal justice, he explained at the launch event. This project continues her work by creating partnerships between courts, law enforcement, and communities to build a more equitable system. The initiative would provide training for judges and law enforcement on recognizing implicit bias, develop community oversight mechanisms, and create educational programs about constitutional rights during police encounters. Raymond also maintained contact with Darnell Washington, the engineering student he had met in the holding cell. Despite his traumatic experience, Darnell had decided to pursue law school after completing his engineering degree, inspired by witnessing the legal system's capacity for both injustice and correction. Raymond became his mentor, providing guidance on law school applications and eventually writing his recommendation letters. The Wilcox County Sheriff's Department underwent comprehensive reform under federal supervision. With its leadership removed and practices exposed, the department became an unexpected model for transformation. New Sheriff Tamika Johnson, a former state trooper with a background in community policing, implemented transparency measures that rebuilt trust with local residents. Officers received enhanced training on constitutional rights and cultural awareness, while citizen complaint procedures were overhauled to ensure accountability. 1 year after the trial, Raymond presided over a special ceremony at his Atlanta courthouse, awarding Darnell Washington a citizenship award for establishing a community legal education program in underserved neighborhoods. The program taught residents about their rights during police encounters, how to document misconduct, and pathways for addressing grievances. "Knowledge is protection," Darnell told the audience. "When we understand our rights, we're better equipped to ensure they're respected." After the ceremony, Raymond returned to his chambers to find a letter had been forwarded from the federal correctional facility where Sergeant Holloway was serving his sentence. Opening it cautiously, he found several handwritten pages. "Judge Carter," the letter began, "I've spent a year thinking about our encounter and its consequences. While nothing can excuse my actions that night, I want you to know I'm using this time to understand the prejudices that guided my behavior throughout my career." Holloway described his participation in racial bias education programs and his gradual recognition of how deeply discrimination had been normalized in his worldview. "I will never ask for your forgiveness," he wrote, "but I wanted you to know that your words at the sentencing hearing about transformation have stayed with me. I am trying to become someone different than the man who put you face down on that asphalt." Raymond placed the letter beside his mother's photograph on his desk. The system had worked this time, justice had been served, accountability established, reforms implemented. Yet he harbored no illusions about the work still ahead. For every case that made headlines, countless others remained invisible. For every department that reformed others, continued discriminatory practices unchallenged. His mother had understood this reality, that progress comes not in sweeping victories, but in persistent incremental advances across generations. As he prepared for his afternoon docket, Raymond recommitted himself to this ongoing struggle, knowing that true justice is never finally achieved but constantly pursued. His wrongful detention had transformed from personal humiliation into professional purpose, becoming another link in the long chain of efforts toward the American promise of equal justice under law. Do you believe our justice system can truly change for the better? This story shows how one person's experience can lead to meaningful reform. But real transformation requires all of us to recognize injustice when we see it and take action. Comment below with your thoughts on what it would take to create truly equal justice in America. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who need to hear this important message. Thank you for joining me for this powerful true story of justice, accountability, and the ongoing work of building a more perfect union. Judge Raymond Carter's story teaches us that justice isn't abstract, it's deeply personal and requires constant vigilance. No one, regardless of their achievements or position, is immune to racial prejudice when systems are designed to perpetuate discrimination. True change demands more than punishing individual wrongdoers. It requires transforming the institutions that enable them. Carter's experience reminds us that dignity in the face of injustice is powerful, but it's not enough. We need accountability, transparency, and structural reform. Most importantly, this story reveals how a single incident can become a catalyst for systemic change when channeled properly. Carter chose to use his painful experience to create lasting reform rather than seek mere vengeance. His mother's civil rights legacy lived on through his judicial response, proving that justice, while imperfect, can evolve when good people refuse to stay silent. The Eleanor Carter Justice Project shows that healing requires both acknowledging past wrongs and creating new pathways forward. Finally, Officer Keller's tragic journey demonstrates that systems of oppression damage everyone involved, even those who initially appear to benefit from them. Has racial profiling touched your life or someone you know? Share your story in the comments below. We can only address injustice when we acknowledge its reality in our communities. If you believe everyone deserves equal treatment under the law, regardless of their skin color, hit that like button to show your support. Subscribe to hear more powerful stories about ordinary people standing up against systemic discrimination and creating real change. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that racism isn't just about individual bad actors, it's about systems that need transformation. Thank you for listening to this important story. Remember, justice isn't just a concept in courtrooms. It's something we build together through our daily choices and the courage to speak truth to power.